I think that when I started in real estate a couple of years ago, then there was a lot of talking about facility management and HR should be on the same table when it comes to these decisions. And I think in the last years, there are some good examples of that, but also generally, I think there's a lot of traditional ways of decision making and approach to that. But COVID obviously has reshaped our thinking a lot. So from, being together within an office, we all were individually working from home. And I think that brought a lot of autonomy back to our ways of working. But what we really noticed is that the social component was really lacking and creativity started to lack, etc. So if you think about hybrid working and now how are we going to go back to the office, it's not just about creating workspaces, it's around creating hybrid cultures almost. How are you going to do that? And how's the social component then tapping into that? But maybe as an anthropologist, you...
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because one of the things that we're saying, right, is that we work individually from home. But I think essentially pre-COVID, we were already working individually in the office. The only aspect that we did have in the office was the social. And there were a couple of companies that would really collaborate. And you would see that in the company culture and it would show. But a lot of what we did was individual. We did a lot of occupancy measurements and we measure what people do in the office. And even the meeting rooms were used by one person to make phone calls or to be in a private space. The social aspect, however, I think changed by working remotely. And I think partly a large group of that has then realized that the social can also be a part of your personal life, right? And it doesn't necessarily need to be your colleagues. And we've made kind of a shift also in investing in social relationships like our families during this time that we might have not done pre-COVID because we didn't have the time to, we were more in the office. Now we're coming back. We're still working massively individually in the office, but we now also have this new social realm that we need to sustain. And we want the social contacts with our colleagues again. And I think we kind of made a wish list of we want all these different things, but in reality, we can't really sustain that in a way that we were working pre-COVID. So I think from that perspective, what is challenging now is the culture, the company cultures that were really existing around individual work and social cohesion. Now we want to bring collaboration into that mix, and that social cohesion has gotten a new definition. So I think that's a challenge going forward.
Do you think that we've really got a good measurement or even like a definition of what collaboration is? This is something that I always really challenge people on, because I think people assume this kind of phenotype of collaboration where you're sat with your buddies around a table with your coffee and your sofa. But collaboration is also, Microsoft did a big study a couple of years ago, where collaboration can also be someone stood over your desk for 2 minutes while you dictate an email. Yeah. It can be asynchronous with someone in a completely different country. The piece of research I'm working on at the moment is with a colleague in the US who I've never met. So I think that's also a really big component that we've kind of in a way jumped on this let's get together and collaborate bandwagon without really understanding, well, what is it? How can I measure it? And is that even the right thing to facilitate in my business?
And is practical collaboration actual collaboration? I mean, sitting over someone's shoulder and reading an email might look like collaboration, but it can actually be someone who has an individual stake in doing that. I think that a lot of collaboration that we do is still focus on our individual gain, and that true collaboration is creating an organization where you're in there for a shared purpose, shared belonging. And
yeah, but maybe aside the collaboration side, it's also about knowledge sharing, I think, and how informal you can facilitate that in the office. So I think that when we were looking at the real estate, really the physical building side of things, we also started with, okay, how can we optimize the building's performance so that all of the conditions, whether visible or invisible, are at their best. And then what do we need to do in order to drive serendipity and spontaneous interactions, collaboration? So all of those things that actually I think are lacking when you are working from home is a driver within the physical building space. And I think that if I'm also a big fan of Leesman, probably known with all of you, and I think they've identified a couple of distinguishing factors when it comes to creating good workplace experience. And one of them is the ability to informally sit together, have a small chat, etc. So it's not about only the formal structures, and that's informal knowledge sharing is, I think, super important.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm trying to think of the word when you're talking. There's tacit knowledge and untacit, detacit, intacit knowledge. But there's kind of knowledge that you can really formulate, and you can put a process around, and you can, like mentoring, for example. There's a professor, Karen Stevenson, who talks about the networks that exist within organizations, and informal networks, bonding networks, social networks are incredibly important. But you can't process size that type of knowledge sharing. You can't document, you can't create a furniture or design interaction that says, here's some sofas. That means that you're going to have this type of interaction. And I think the point that you just raised around home working is that prior to COVID, when the majority of us were coming into the office 5 days a week, you kind of didn't need to formalize any of this. It would happen because you were just there. But now that people are working in different locations, different environments, different ways, different times, now to some degree you have to facilitate these previously slightly hidden but very important connections that were going on. I think one of the issues of our industry, at least, is that we have to be really careful not to think that there's a design solution that's going to kind of deterministically enable that type of interaction.
Can't force it, I think. That's very true. Although I do think that there are some interesting examples of this. How can design facilitate for knowledge sharing and informal collaboration? I think there was an interesting book by Cal Newport. He wrote the book Deep Working. He described a hallway within, I think, back then the MIT building where there was research going on. And so people would have their individual office or workspace to work on their research. But the hallway was just big enough so you'd run into a colleague, could have a chat, and then it would bring you to an idea, and you'd go back and have your personal space where you could, work on that idea. And I think the same thing. There is an anecdote, and I don't know if it's true, but supposedly Steve Jobs wanted only one set of bathrooms in the huge Apple campus that he was still thinking about back in the day, so that people would run into each other while going to the bathroom. So I think this didn't happen ultimately, but that's how far the thinking was in how can I foster or design for serendipity and for innovation. Yeah. And I think that there's also a huge potential there with data and measuring. In one of our recent conversations, we also spoke about the organizational network analysis, where you really start identifying the networks and behavioral patterns within buildings. And there you could say, okay, I see that people are clustering here, so something's happening. And how can I maybe copy paste that? Or, and I think that's also an interesting research done by Humanize, MIT-born company, where they looked at different sales departments from, I think, a bank. And they noticed that the one department was performing very well and the other wasn't. And the difference was that they were just not on the same floor. So they put them back together, very simplistically spoken. But so in that sense, measuring that could bring a lot of design ideas.
Yeah, there is a Microsoft study where they show that people within 200 meters of each other with a desk, they communicate more. And then when you communicate across departments, so finance, marketing, etc., you're more productive and you feel more connected to the company and indeed the purpose, because you both mentioned purpose, which I think is essential for any company to be successful. I mean, we're in the real estate industry. What do you think we can do from a design, build, facilitate perspective to help enable these things? Because also you mentioned serendipity and these collisions where energy is created, knowledge is shared.
Yeah. Build better buildings. Right. To be honest, not to kind of rob your tagline at edge, but I think one of the things about people in the real estate industry that maybe we don't appreciate as much as we should is the level of impact that we have on, not to sound too dramatic or esoteric, but culture, civilization, the way we engage, the way people live, work, play, eat, drink, connect with one another. We were just talking before about the way that you integrate different social groups. Architecture and the way in which we design cities and space has a fundamental impact on that, whether it's access to green space and reduced rates of depression, which is being researched and has been shown to absolutely have positive impacts on depression, whether it's multi-tenanted buildings and making sure that you have equal low income housing corresponding to private housing, and social cohesion and levels of social mobility. It has a fundamental impact on the way in which people live and work together. From an office perspective, I mean, we spend a third of our lives at work. So from my perspective, and of course, studying the biological impacts of being at work and what it means to work, there's a level of environmental quality that, to be honest, for lots of organizations and lots of buildings, is not really at par. And that's around lighting, air quality, acoustics, etc.
Right.
But there's a level deeper about designing mind-friendly environments, inclusive environments that use either principles of biophilic design. I mean, we're really at the beginning of understanding the way in which these kind of repeated patterns impact concentration and cognitive processes for people. And I think that for me, of course, that's the most fundamental importance of our industry going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a topic that thankfully now is starting to be integrated in the real estate industry and in the design of our buildings. I think when it comes to creating or designing for serendipity and interaction, if you walk around this building at Olympic, where we're now sitting, you'll see that there are little nooks, for instance, within the centralized staircase, so you could continue your conversation on the staircase without blocking it, etc. So sometimes it just is very simple but effective. And I think there are lots of seats where you can just sit and have a chat. So also shown with the research that we've done that works very well, the variety of different spaces and options. And then I do think that, like you said, the architectural design, not only inside of the building, but definitely also outside, is becoming more and more important. So we are actually really required by municipalities and cities, investors also, to think about the social inclusion side, to design for public and neighborhood quality, thankfully, because then you can actually really talk to groups that living around this building or would be entering this building on a frequent basis, and what do they need aside only the office workers. So I'm happy to see that there are a lot of mixed-use buildings coming up. What are you going to do with your ground floor? I think in London, it wasn't really the standard to open up to people. So it would be like big reception areas. But now you see that it's tremendously changing. So tapping into the social side of that. And I'd love to come back to your the way we can design for different mental qualities as well.
Yeah. I agree partly. I think, in the basic lines, we need to redesign our space so it's attractive, and so that it is, it encourages serendipitous encounters, and that we don't really have to think about running into people and innovating. It comes naturally. At the same time, we're still thinking of kind of the office as a box, and it needs to be a part of the entire system. It needs to be incorporated, right? I mean, we can have a lovely office here, and I think your office works quite well, but it also works quite well because you have the type of people that work well in this building and that live nearby this building, and therefore can integrate this building into their lives quite well. I've seen very similar office spaces that haven't been used at all, and that do have the smart kind of design interventions that are put into place, but it's very quiet and it's not used, because I think that when designing a building, you really need to understand who your users are. Unfortunately, often the building already exists before you have the users in your office building, and then you design a space. You design an office floor for that user, but that office might actually be very far away from the people that are coming into it. And so I think that the integration, especially now in a hybrid reality, where we want to find out that purpose of why we're working and what we're doing. We want to be able to integrate that into our lives, and not just the community where the building is, which I do think is really important. And I think that will also create a buzz, but it's also about what do your employees want? Where do they want to work, and what do they need?
Yeah, might go one step further. So we would be measuring, we could do pre-measurement, right, and assess what kind of things do people want to see back in their office. And I think we are doing that at Cushman, you're doing that. But it might go one step further. It's like, what does your life look like? What is your daily journey? And how does the workspace fit into that?
I think that's a really key point, because when you design a building, or when you're essentially designing a piece of a city, right? And that's going to stand as the legacy, especially if it's a building for potentially hundreds of years. When you're designing a fit out of a workplace, that's going to last you like a good 10 years. And if business isn't going so well, maybe 15 with a bit of light touch. So it's kind of a static thing that you're designing for. Yeah. But actually, people that are going to come and work in your business in even 5 years' time probably look and sound and want very differently from the people who are in your organization now. So a lot of what we try to do is also pull back, if you like, the value chain when we engage with clients to say, don't just survey your existing workforce. Also look at what are they teaching the people that you're going to be hiring in 5 years now, because the curriculum for a broker, for example, is very different now than what you're hiring for. What they learn now is tech and data analytics and kind of market knowledge and how to pull that together in a consultancy package for a client. It's not what I was taught when I was doing kind of real estate in 2003 or whenever it was. And I think that's also an incredibly important part of the integration between the built environment and people, is that you have something that is very static and you have something that is very dynamic.
Absolutely.
You mentioned life phases. My biological needs when I'm a parent of 2 small children is very different than my biological profile of when I'm 67 or when I'm 27. And I think trying to design environments where you can encompass individual life phases as well is a huge challenge.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. And I think that on one aspect, there are different, let's say we're talking or touching the point of neurodiversity, I think, although we didn't call out the term. But I think that's one thing, like, hey, there are so many different people with different mental needs. How could we design for that? Then how is that working demographically, different age categories? And I think what I found very interesting in one of the recent conversations that we've had is that you tapped out, I think either Gerda or Sophie, you said that the demographic or the needs for different demographic groups are very different. So where maybe our generation work and life is very blurred, the younger generations actually want to have that more distinguished, I think.
Yeah, we see that in our own team, that, you know, the younger generation that's coming in is really about set times, and this is what I'm going to do. And it's still output driven, you know, it's not as rigid as you can be, but it's different from how we experience it. And when it comes to neurodiversity, I think that we're more and more considering that we're not the same and we all have our individual preferences. And I think that's a great direction that we're going in. But I also think that for you, I think everyone's neurodiverse, and I think everybody goes through a certain process, and it's somewhere in the, I want to say in the middle of your life when you're in young kids, maybe in a job, or, you know, life is really getting at you, that you realize, oh, wow, this really ticks me off. But that self-understanding takes a while. So I also think when it comes to designing neurodiverse spaces, we also need to equip the people in the space to understand what worked well for them, and what is this tiredness, or is this a reaction to something I experienced during the day? And
so I have a question on that. So I mean, you're talking about the neurodiversity. They're different generational. They're different, even parts of your lifetime where you require different things or desire different things. How do you design that flexibility into a hard build environment? And then how do you measure it, right? So how do you know, even if as a person, you know, in the summer, maybe you're happier, healthier because there's more light. In the winter, the darkness gets to you. Like, how do you have that flexibility and then have some sort of quantified self to measure?
Well, I guess I would say, and some people might say, if you allow people to work from home, in a way, maybe you don't need to. And maybe that's why working from home has been so successful for some people, because that is an environment that is individually tailored and cultivated to individual needs.
Right.
From a neurodiverse perspective, just to come back on your point, neurodiversity is kind of a normal distribution in the population, with neurodiverse people who identify as neurodiverse down one end. And I think it's very important that we don't we at least kind of ring fence at people who identify as neurodiverse. And I don't think, to be honest, a disclosure of whether you identify as someone with neurodiversity or whether you're a young parent with extreme tiredness, I actually don't think that matters at all. And I think that's something that a lot of organizations make the mistake of kind of trying to ring fence people as neurodiverse. This is your space. Right. There's a whole range of arguments as to why that is a terrible idea. But I think the point around this kind of normal distribution of mental health and well-being is incredibly important in life phases. But you're right, going back to your point around how do you kind of, in a static floor plan, in a way, create spaces that are inclusive for a whole range of people, is incredibly problematic. I mean, the three things that I would come back to from a design perspective, because I think also culture and your point around How do you give people permission? How do you educate people how to use the space that you've created? What is intended for them is something different, and even acknowledging how their own personal health state is. And maybe we can touch on kind of quantifiable self in a little bit, because that's something that I know you have a lot of knowledge on and have a particular view on. But I think flexibility is key at designing kind of flexible spaces that are not static, that can be accommodated for different types of work patterns. In a way, it's kind of like a mental health activity-based working profile. Like, let's turn the temperature right down in this area. Let's put in a load of sound masking. And this is just our quiet space. Don't come here. I'm in like full concentration. I'm in full flow. Let's even put like a 2-hour time limit on it, because that's the kind of generally accepted time as to when you can kind of get into flow state and be at peak flow. Having that level of flexibility is incredibly important. But I think technology and the interconnection between people understanding their own baseline and what I need, and connecting that through technology and predicted IoT into, hey, Sophie, I see that you didn't sleep well last night because your 2-year-old was up crying. The heart rate variability is really high. I suggest you sit here today. Oh, and by the way, I know you've got a meeting with Gerda for 3 hours in the afternoon. So I'm going to tell her to sit here. She's great. She got loads of sleep. So you can sit in different areas, but you can be close by. Yeah. I think that starts to get very interesting as to how you can kind of, in a way, facilitate some of the informal stuff that would have previously happened through technology and measurement in that way.
I think that's really interesting. And I think we're really close to being able to do that. I think we've already designed our spaces to be diverse and to be flexible. I mean, the newest workplaces that are being delivered are that, but it's behavior that's lagging behind. So, I mean, I might get that signal on my watch saying, oh, you didn't sleep very well, or you slept very well, so don't sit near to Sophie who didn't sleep very well. It's then my choice or my understanding of what that impact has. So if I get a message saying I didn't sleep very well, you go sit in a quiet area, then I might think, yeah, but I have a lot to discuss with Sophie. I'm going to sit next to her anyways. And that might be detrimental to my productivity during the day. And then that coming to quantifiable self, I think educating ourselves on what the impact is of bad sleep, of working on bad sleep. If you can see the differences of your output on a good day and a bad day, and understand what the different spaces do with you. And I know that that is like far out there, but I think that's the only answer to really get people to act on these spaces, because we have these wonderful spaces, but we have no clue how to use them.
Well, I think that from really a core and shell perspective, because obviously there's so much that is important for well-being in the interior phase, in the fit-out phase, but also in the operational phase, right, with healthy food, etc. Oftentimes, Edge delivers the core and shell, and we set the basis right for a client and tenant to draw on that and build on that within their fit-out. But so in terms of flexibility, a couple of things that we do is like flexible air systems, so that a meeting space can easily become an office space, etc. So you make it a bit more hackable, even though it's a bit challenging with a big building, but there are ways of doing that. And I think more on the invisible biological needs that people have, incorporate as much daylight as possible, so that you're actually a passive receiver of the benefits that we designed for. So we tested a little bit of that with a smart wearable together with University College London a few years ago, where we measured light intake. And did we design with daylight? Yes. But what happens if people start behaving throughout the building? Do they still capture that? And we found that, at least in this building, people were able to capture 2.5 times more daylight than they would do in a regular office. So that confirms that that's at least working out well. Yeah. And then I think the interesting part is we did a project in Berlin, Grand Central Berlin, that's just opened, and we had a look at these different things. So how intense are my spaces in terms of lights and noise, in terms of social interaction that I see around me, in terms of biophilia, in terms of noise, etc. So we identified a couple of things and then created a sequence throughout the existing floor plan. It's like, okay, if you have a need for full concentration, go here. And like you said, I think this coming to a state of flow actually requires to go from a lot of like buzz around you to less and less and less until you reach that point of optimal concentration. So we've designed for different worker types with different tasks. So someone who concentrates a lot throughout the day, but also someone that's collaborating a lot with others, someone who's multitasking a lot. And can they use the floor plan in different ways to optimize their brain performance?
Yeah.
So it's designed for that. Now all we need to do is actually confirm that with research. So I'd invite you to come and have a look and see if that works.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, to be honest, from my perspective, that's really the most important thing, is validating. I think that we have all the right ideas, we have all the right hypotheses. It's really about, in a way, almost in a way, limited by the measurement and the validity of it. Because I think if we could prove what different types of people work well in this type of light environment, for example, or again, people don't get into flow necessarily in the same way. You can be hypo-stimulated, so you need a very quiet space to kind of equalize out at zero, but you can also be hypo-stimulated and you need to be surrounded by people to kind of level out at zero. Yeah. In a way, that's like the complexity of being human. It's kind of impossible to create like a methodology or a process, or is kind of think of these types of things in like Excel equations or like research methodologies and statistics. It's impossible in a way. There's just so many variables.
Yeah, absolutely.
And with the right type of methodology, which I don't know that we necessarily have available to us yet, certainly I don't, but we're getting closer to it. But just even taking that more kind of quantitative perspective, which is why I think kind of the integration with technology and statistical measurements is incredibly important, because you have to balance it with the behavior. And I know we always have this conversation that I'm always about the quantitative and you're much more about the qualitative and the behavior, but we need both, because until we can get that and validate it, it's just more hypothesis in a way.
And what do you think on the data protection? Because we have sensors, we can measure how many people are in the room, and often what happens, and we had this conversation yesterday with an office in Berlin. So, you know, we're tracking to say that make sure it's not one person in a big conference room, but people are actually putting Post-its over the cameras, even though we inform them like, hey, these are not, they just know you're a person. We count the number of people. We know you're not a dog or a plant. And then at the same time, you see consumers, you know, they'll put facial recognition, upload your face onto a photo, and it turns into a 16th century painting. But in the work context, there seems to be a lack of trust for giving data, because some of that technology exists. As we could tell you the right place to work. If you gave us feedback, we could tell you this is when you're in the flow and the most productive. But there's this real barrier to say, like, I don't even want a camera counting if I'm one person in a room. How do we close that gap?
I got to tell you, for me, like, this is the biggest, as a researcher, this is the biggest issue. I have some very strong opinions about it. First of all, I want to say that I appreciate why we have GDPR.
Yes.
And everyone has a right to anonymity, and everyone has a right to protect their own data.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That said, we live in a world where we have two dimensions. One where you freely share your data. Anytime you go on Google, Mr. Google knows you've signed the terms and conditions. They know what you're looking at. They know how much money you spend on Amazon. They know what you're buying at bol.com. And they can connect to all of that. And you freely participate in that. So I think there's an education about making sure that people truly understand that when they're living their daily lives, we're already part of a world where we are mining people's data and patterns, not at an individual level, but at a population level.
Agreed.
The other aspect of it for me is that's incredibly necessary. It's important that we understand, even from a medical perspective, and I always use genome-wide association studies as an example. It's incredibly important that we understand that when this population of people take this medicine, that it has this reaction. Why do we know that? Because we mine their data.
Exactly.
Because we're able to look across populations and say, I see that actually when we've treated people in the past with your type of profile, this doesn't work for them. And to be honest, that's, from my perspective, what we're trying to do with GDPR. We're trying to understand, or at least data analytics, we're trying to understand at a population level, what are the patterns, big patterns of population behavior, big patterns of population activity, biological processes that interact with certain defined variables in the environment, round tables versus square tables, level of oxygen in offices, etc. We can only do that. That can only be helpful, digestible, and useful and progressive for us as a human basis, if you like, civilization, if we're allowed in the right way to access the data. And as that, from that perspective, I think that GDPR in its current context has in a way lost its original essence. And I think that is in its current construct a potential inhibitor to us developing data-driven, evidence-based insights, which is the way in which our going. notwithstanding that people have the right to anonymity.
Absolutely.
But for me, it's around making sure that we can protect people's right to participate, but you're already participating. You're a human living your life in a Western civilization where you engage and benefit from this stuff. So for me, it's also about education.
I think it's only a small percentage that is actually against gathering the data.
Right.
I think it's a cultural issue within a company. There's a trust issue if your employees do that. There's probably also an issue with you giving back on the data that you receive, right? We personally only give data because we benefit from it. And I mean, we have a similar tool as Leesman. We have XSF, and we get really good insights out of that. And we give that to any company free of charge because it's a data pool for us. And we get insights from that. You get your own insights from that as well. So there's something in it for you. And I think that's, when it comes to data, that's important. When it comes to sensor technology, we often forget to feed back that data to our users in a way that it is useful for them.
Exactly.
And there, I think that quantifiable self, if you can connect the sensor data of a building to yourself, and you can see what the impact is, then you're fine, because then it has immediate impact on you.
I think that's a very valid point. I think we've seen a little bit of that with the wearable light sensor that we use from Liz, where people loved it, that they got their own personal report as to how much light they were receiving throughout the day, when were their peak performance moments, how was light impacting their sleep, etc. That really helped them. It also nudged their behavior in different ways. But obviously, at Edge, we design buildings that are IoT enabled. They collect a lot of data on the indoor performance, etc. And there are thoughts, of course, like how can we feed that back to an individual? So perhaps I have my smartwatch on and I see, hey, throughout the day I've been sitting in spaces with a lot of good air quality, or maybe now I need to move out because the oxygen is it needs to be refreshed or whatever. So there are so many things that we could offer.
I do think also that we are very stubborn people. So you can tell me that I'm sitting in a very bad quality space, but I love the green on the wall, so I don't care what my watch is going to tell me. And that's why I think it's so powerful that I can say to the system, I can say, I love this room, I love working here. And it can tell me, okay, it's not the best for your health, but then after a while, we'll realize that I don't really care about that and that I will want to sit here.
Or a few compensatory things, like you sat here because you really liked it, but okay, now you need to go for a walk. You got to move. You got to go home anyway.
Yeah.
So just take the bus.
To what extent do you think that people's behavior will be nudged? I don't know if you've seen examples. We've seen it with the light wearable, definitely, but I know that people don't often like the now you have to stand up because you've been sitting so long that it pushes them to change their behavior, that the system tells you a little bit too much about.
I think it needs a gamification aspect to it, because even with the light example, I'm assuming, maybe I'm not right, but I'm assuming that after a while it wears off the effect and people don't use it anymore. And that's the same with all the Fitbit apps and everything, right? We're really enthusiastic for like a month, and then we die down for 3 months, and then we're really enthusiastic for a month when they come up with a new feature, and then it dies out. So I think there needs to be a gamification aspect in it where you can compare, or where you can, it needs to constantly evolve. You need to constantly engage. And that's somewhere where we as a real estate industry, we need to connect with these other industries to make sure that what we offer from that perspective is something that keeps going to the next stage. And it's not just...
or at least it's kind of like has a biomimicry effect. It also represents, the technology also has to be humanistic in a way. Like, I'm not motivated in the same way that you're motivated, in the same way that you're motivated. Maybe I'm like particularly motivated about my health right now. And maybe you're particularly motivated about career progression. And maybe you're particularly motivated about something else. I don't know, waiting until it's Friday afternoon. But everyone's motivated in a different way. We're all framed in a different way. So I also think with a lot of this technology, in a way it has to, and this gets a bit scary, but it has to be humanized to a certain degree to also connect in. So if I'm motivated by health, telling me, Sophie, stand up because your heart rate variability is terrible, that might really motivate me. You might be like, yeah, okay, I already drank 10 cups of coffee because I'm on 5 deadlines today. Okay, Gerda, you're motivated by something else. Okay, let me connect into that. I think there's a way that the technology has to also progress, and which is why I'm interested in the the quantifiable, self-quantifiable buildings movement, because there's a humanist aspect that I also think that we miss at the moment.
I mean, it should be informative, easy to use. It should be, I heard an expression once, these apps should be like a toothbrush. You use it a few times a day and it's in your natural flow. It gives you value as well. So it doesn't feel forced, but you're like, oh, I'm benefiting from this. Yeah. And it's interesting you mentioned that, right? Because also you talk about Fitbit and then I'm thinking about teams, right? Like how do teams come together? If you join the gym by yourself, your probability of going often is not much, but we have a trainer here. We did Mud Masters on our team. He's helping us now with the filming, but now as a team together, we train together. So when you're doing it as a team, then you're more likely to participate. How do you think that works for spaces, technology to bring people together? Because that's where I see the magic happening, is when people get together. It can even be virtually, and that it's that team, that purpose, that event. Yeah. Like, how does technology enable that, or in the build space?
I also think, to be honest, this is the bit that if we get wrong, and it's the bit that's most at risk of glossing over, is actually going to be fundamentally the biggest missed opportunity and the biggest risk to this whole period of kind of contemporary work. I mentioned at the beginning that from my perspective, we're getting more and more individual, my individual experience, my individual schedule, catering to my individual needs.
Right.
But I think what you're talking about is the we, or what I call the we, like the measurement of, okay, my individual need to work from home because I want to do my thing in the morning and take my children to school and I don't want to sit in traffic. That's mine. But what happens if someone else's experience of coming to the office is predicated on my presence, for example? Mm-hmm. Let's say that your presence in the office directly contributes to my experience. How do we measure that? How do we foster that? And you can even broaden that out to kind of a more kind of societal perspective. We keep building, these beautiful monolithic structures that are focused around like the 1% of people, the Zoast, the City of London you mentioned, Frankfurt, these kind of institutional hubs of work. But how do you kind of create social connectivity and social cohesion with people? That's the we. And unless we get that right and focus on that with a measurement, with some type of process, and maybe technology is the way to start with that.
I think you're making a very valid point, because I think here in this building, we measure everything. So, and there are screens on the wall that will tell you, hey, the oxygen is at a level where you need to get out of the space, because otherwise, virus-wise, you could be at a little bit of a higher risk. It's so well managed here that if there would be another lockdown or another outbreak, I would be completely comfortable coming here. I know that everything is safe and sound. However, I was talking to a large corporate client, and that example was like, hey, I still have people, even though we've opened our offices again, that do not come. And she just managed to get one of the persons that was working from home longest to come to the office because she was there. So the social and also maybe the team part and the managerial part of that leadership is super important in drawing people back as well. Yeah.
I want to zoom out a bit, and also conscientious of time, but a few things have been mentioned: identity, culture, community, and you mentioned you coming in the office is predicated on me being there, and we actually hear that a lot. Is I came in the office, but no one was there, so now I'm not going back again. So there's a bit of that network effect, and then if you extend that out and you say, okay, London, San Francisco, Zout, Amsterdam, like, okay, if you go there at 9 o'clock at night or on a Saturday morning, you have these beautiful buildings with full kitchens, auditoriums, entranceways, and they close down at 7 o'clock at night. I was at a technology conference a few weeks ago in San Francisco, and we had cocktails after in the building, beautiful building, bay views, and then they kicked us out, so we had to go to a kind of a seedy bar. But then you're downtown San Francisco, and it's a ghost town. It's 8 o'clock at night on a Wednesday with these beautiful buildings with digital screens and entryways and full kitchens. And I'm like, why couldn't we stay in one of those buildings? And why can't we bring the whole community, right? Not just this group of 30 people that were at the tech conference, but why are we not activating these buildings in these city centers? I think they should be 24/7.
Now you see that in London, the requirements are that, for instance, the school next to your building should be able to make use of the auditorium, etc. So, and that could be, extended to after office hours. And you have to arrange things with security, of course, but that's a solvable thing, right?
Technology is a tool to solve that. That's solvable. Yeah.
But it has always been a security issue, right? I mean, confidentiality, we always make a really big deal out of it because everything is confidential. But I do agree. I do see that changing, and maybe the housing crisis is a big part of that.
Or the fuel crisis.
It's too expensive to live in a big city, and if they do live in a big city, then small houses, etc. We're talking to clients that are considering opening up their office spaces in the weekends or for students. I mean, we've had discussions internally around this about how can we open up our work cafe for our students and after hours, etc.
And what's the driver there? Is that then from hey, we have this space, it's so inefficient, or is it also as an additional ROI model for some of?
Of course, it's double. I mean, on the one hand, it's real estate that's empty. We're a real estate company. So, I mean, we see the inefficiencies there. On the other side, it's also getting in these students, and we have a war on talent. So getting them known with our company. But we also have members in our organization that are working for charity funds, and they have meetings in our office space at night. And for us, it's okay, but getting people to understand that is okay and that it becomes comfortable to ask for that permission, because now it's kind of asking for permission, that still needs a shift. But we do see that change coming. I would love it if our Rotterdam office would open up for birthday events in the weekend, because I mean, I really don't like throwing a birthday party. It's just crowded and the acoustics at home are terrible. I mean, we have a lovely office on the 21st floor in Rotterdam with an amazing view, with an amazing space that's empty. I mean, it would be great if we could just.
When's your birthday again? And I'm going to put it in my agenda now.
You'll get an invitation. If I get permission to do it in Rotterdam, I'll invite you.
Yeah, it sounds like a date. So.
But I think that's right. I think it's about asset utilization as well. And to be honest, I think this could all be solved with one fail kind of like cut of the Russian pipeline, to be honest.
Yeah.
And I say that as a bit of a tongue in cheek, but I think the kind of economic issues that we could be facing in the foreseeable future actually have the risk to derail everything that's happened in the last few years. Especially with regards to asset utilization.
Yeah.
We still have to keep the amount of energy it takes to keep a building running, even when no one's here, is phenomenal. And I really appreciate that until.
I can show you the data. We have a client meeting this afternoon. We're going to show them how much they're using during the nights and weekends when no one's in there.
It's crazy. And a lot of it you can't avoid. And during the lockdown, I worked for our facilities management business. And it was in one way, it was absolutely fascinating, to be honest. The amount of power and energy that goes into kind of holding these buildings open, even if no one decides to show up or is able to show up, is crazy. So there's definitely kind of an asset utilization issue, and I think maybe like an ethical issue. When I see the kind of CO2 emissions of a country, the built environment is always at least a third.
Right.
There's kind of an ethical issue at some point in time, like we have to start making better use of this space. I think it also goes back to your point in the beginning, which is what is the role of organizations? And actually, if we end up going through the shift where there's a lot of predictions around the average tenure of employees reducing, in a way, do organizations become like universities or like training grounds or like innovation hubs where you kind of join for 3 years, you do your project and you take that knowledge and you go on to the next? And if that's the case, then actually you can design university space or organizational space, commercial space in a very different way.
Right.
I also, data security or security generally is not my forte, but I would love to also have a conversation with someone who really understands that space to understand, is there really a security issue or is it a kind of perceived security issue? My hypothesis being that so much is now saved in the cloud, so much is on individual devices or kind of, in the cloud, that I wonder how much of a security or risk that really poses, certainly as technology progresses and hybrid work progresses.
It's an easy excuse. It's a safety guard that we use and we've always used. I mean, it was also the pushback to more open spaces because the conversations we have are confidential, even though you're my colleague and you have the full right to hear what I'm talking about with my clients, for instance.
But I mean, I worked in cloud computing, and those were always the similar issues. It was all about asset utilization because keeping a data center cooled and running that you're using 25% of the time is inefficient.
Right.
Cloud data centers you can run 65% of the time, but then the issue is always security. But there, like security on servers, you can create firewalls or access keys, right? So you probably booked to an event and you get a QR code and it lets you in. And then it lets you into certain areas, but not other areas, right? If you're a VIP at a club, you can go to that layer. So the security is solvable. Yes, you need to have the right rules and take into consideration, but technology shouldn't be a barrier there. No. I wouldn't call that a showstopper for having more utilization rate in offices.
Yeah.
It needs to be considered, of course.
Yeah. I also think there's a way in which you can design kind of open source stuff. Like the more socially minded we become, more community minded we become, the more open source stuff has to be.
Yeah.
And I think that again goes back to your opening point around the role of organizations.
Yeah.
In the 80s, it was kind of keep everything secret, competitive advantage. Who gets their first wins? But is that still the case? So much is so open source nowadays, whether it's true or not, that's something different. But how do organizations kind of compete in a way nowadays? Is it just by the talent that they got at the time? Is it by this kind of secretive first to market? Is it by some other measure? That's an interesting thought, right?
Yeah, I've worked in a couple of emerging technologies, one being cloud computing, and then we used to call our competitors our frenemies, right? Because what we didn't want to do was fight over, a fraction of 1% of the market share. We needed to move the whole market together. So we were collaborating and getting the messaging out there, open sourcing the technology, around VPNs, firewalls, et cetera. And that got broader adoption. And then, when the market's big enough, then you can have these really competitive discussions. But when you're trying to push a systematic change, you need collaboration even with your frenemies, your competitors.
I can relate to that as driving the sustainability of buildings forward, but also I think the whole space usage and becoming more efficient with that is also a topic that's emerging right now. And I think in London the market is already very familiar with the fact that you have to at least have 10% of your floor area. You have to dedicate that to affordable workspaces. It's quite a big area, I can tell you. So it's a challenge, I think, for many in that market. How do you do that? And that made me think when I was talking to one of our colleagues in the UK, like, are there smarter ways to fill up this 10%? Not for the sake of not wanting to do it, but just because there's already so much floor area that's probably not used all of the time.
Right.
And can technology then measure maybe what areas are generally quiet on one Monday afternoons, and can that startup sit there for that day? Obviously, this is a theoretical case at the moment. It wouldn't work that way also with regulations, but could that maybe be solved in a different way than just, having to offer floor area?
Really interesting. Really interesting. I think that the one big inhibitor to that is that we tend to, as humans, all follow the same kind of flow, right?
Yeah.
So we have the same days that it's busy and the same days that it's not busy. Therefore, I think the challenge is really, if we want to fill up the space, it's not going to be work filling it up with other work, but it's going to be integrating all the different streams and systems that we have into our buildings. And therefore, maybe on a Monday afternoon, inviting a school or a charity or whatever, because every building will be empty on a Monday afternoon. I don't think Monday afternoon.
No,
that's a good example.
Friday afternoon, yeah.
I think also organizations valuing it and including it in some type of commercial business case, not a social business case. I think that's also a big block to overcome. And more, I think organizations are. But I think, again, from the perspective of, if I allow these charities or students or other kind of demographic groups into our building, what am I going to get out of it? Commercially, the organization is still paying for this stuff, and potentially an even bigger fuel crisis coming, is going to get real expensive. So there needs to be a business case. We don't unfortunately live in some utopian society where people are just so altruistic, they just give it away. But I think, again, if we can come up with a model, or we can demonstrate in a way quantitatively, this is the value of being able to invite these people in. Your employees are more engaged. Yeah. They're connected much more to purpose. There's more drive. There's more associated brand awareness of your organization, and therefore people are more interested to join your business. I think that's also something that we really have to focus on, is not shying away from also making the social issues commercial issues, because they also are.
And I think it's having a couple of people lead, or a couple of organizations lead, because I've had so many ROI conversations with corporates, but even though you show the ROIs or you show it, it's not tactical. Mm-hmm. So you can say that more your employees when they have more purpose, they're more engaged, but it's
Yeah.
so far from what they find tactical or what they find, that they can use, even though it is really
Yeah.
important. If we can show it in best examples, best practices. I mean, it's the number one question we get from corporates is, what is my competitor doing? Nobody wants to be the first one out, but they definitely want to be the second one.
Yeah,
Mhm.
true. That's really true.
So I'm just conscientious of time, and I'd like to wrap it up. Like, what's your request for the industry to help drive this change and activate societies, bring more meaning back to places and people?
Well, I was just going over some research. To me, what comes to mind is that I think data-driven decisions are very important. If you measure what your status is, if you measure where you stand, then you can make informed decisions, whether that is to create a work environment that works well in combination with a home office, or what societal groups are around your building and how they can make use of your building, all of that. So informed decision making, I think, is to me number one on the list.
Yeah, I would say GDPR. I don't know how to say it in a different way. Protecting the essence of what GDPR is, an individual's right to personalize their experience at an individual level, but making sure that we can somehow correspond that to being able to use the data to inform at a population level, building infrastructure, workplace design, so that we can really cultivate and design environments that are going to facilitate better, healthier, happier work. I think that is something that we're going to need to really address. And the other thing, of course, is research. And my particular area of interest, and I think that we should really focus on, is making sure that we can take the kind of environmental research on health and well-being down one level to really looking at mind-friendly environments, making sure that we really understand what is it that's happening in the environment that may be contributing to or affecting some type of mental or physical or vitality related issue, and make sure that we can design effective interventions to support that.
Yeah,
Gerda?
I'm looking for that company that's going to be the first one out.
Nice.
And hopefully we can learn a lot from them. And I'm really looking forward to the integration that I do think is going to come, where we all will benefit from, hopefully.
Yeah, mine's very simple. It's kind of twofold. One is understand that your company culture and your team are paramount, and then they're not just an isolated being. They're part of a community, part of a global community. So some of the stuff is intangible, but everyone knows it's important. And then get started. Like, start measuring now. Start looking at the data so you can make data-driven decisions, not just gut decisions or, oh, I'm forcing this on my employees and I think it's working, but you actually don't know. So
It's incremental learning.
it's start learning now. Don't wait, and then just understand your company culture is paramount. Like, that's going to win longer term. Good. And then my last request is please come back. This was a fantastic session, wonderful discussion. So
Yeah, thank you for inviting us.
no, it's been a
thank you
real
very
pleasure. So thanks so much.